Good day, everyone. So let's get started. I want to start with a little story here. So in the late 1940s, the United States Air Force had a pretty serious problem. The pilots just couldn't maintain control of their planes. This became such a big issue that up to 17 pilots crashed in a single day. So they really had a big issue with this. And the pilots weren't to blame because according to the research that was done, everything on their end was okay. So the researchers themselves were baffled. They didn't really know what to do. And if the pilots weren't causing those crashes, then they were wondering what the problem could be. Researchers eventually connected the dots, and it turns out that back in 1926, when the US military was designing its first ever cockpit, the dimensions that were standardized for the cockpits were based on the data that was found measuring hundreds of pilots. So for over 30 years, the size, the shape of the seat, the distance between the pedals and the stick, for instance, the windshield's height, and even the shape of the pilot's helmet were all based according to the measurements of a 1926 pilot. And clearly, the pilots had gotten bigger since then because they had these problems with controlling the planes. So by 1950, the U.S. Air Force authorized a new study to capture the average measurement of over 4,000 pilots this time. So they really wanted to make sure that they had everything in order. And everybody agreed that by reanalyzing the current average measurements of a pilot, they would fix the issue. But there was one researcher, a young scientist that was part of that group. His name was Gilbert S. Daniels, and he disagreed with the approach. He thought that there had to be more than just building a average measurement or coming up with average measurements for a pilot. There had to be more than just that. And little did he know, he was about to make a discovery that would change the world of design forever. And so using the data that he gathered through his extensive study, he calculated the average of the 10 physical dimensions that were believed to be the most relevant for cockpit design. And those formed what they called the average pilot, so to speak. And so what he found stunned everyone, including himself. Out of all 4,000 pilots that were surveyed in that way, not a single one of them actually fit all 10 measurements for the pilot. And that really led him to conclude that there was really no such thing as an average pilot in the first place. And that makes sense because if you've ever shared a car with someone, for instance, that is from a different build than you, then you know how important it is to adjust a couple of things before you get started. You're going to adjust your mirrors, your seat, maybe even your steering wheel before you consider hitting the gas. And likewise, if you spend any amount of time thinking about accessibility challenges with web design, then Daniel's discovery will definitely make sense to you. It will resonate with you. Sites and apps that are built to please the average users rarely work with the mouse, and they fail to provide a meaningful experience for people with disabilities in general. So products that are built for the average user, for instance, will only work as long as as the users perfectly fit that mold or the predefined parameters that we have there. And as Daniel's findings have taught us, basically, the vast majority of users never actually fit the mold of that average user or that perfect user. So this led Daniels to believe that if you design a cockpit to fit the average pilot, then you've designed it to fit no one. And we argue that the same holds true when it comes to web design. To this day, when most designers would feel comfortable, rather, with the idea of a one-size-fits-all approach. It's relatively easy for designers to fall into the trap of designing for the average user. We basically all end up doing it at one point or another. On the face of it, it seems like it's a good idea. People are obviously have needs that vary a little bit, but they can't be varying that much, is what people usually think about. And surely it's possible to design something that will work around the needs of most people. But when we talk about most people, we actually leave a lot of people behind by doing so. So this vision of design, we feel that this vision of design is flawed. And this first webinar in this series will show you how and what we can do about that. Through our research, we came across a book written by Eric Meyer and Sarah Walker-Bettker called "Designing for Real Life." A really great book that talks about how designers can't always predict the conditions in which the users are going to be using their site. And what they focus about mostly in the book is this idea of the emotional state in which the users might be and how that might affect their experience using the content, and how designing with compassion, for instance, and putting yourselves in someone else's shoes will help you build something that will work better for everyone. So the book is about debunking the myth that it's okay to overlook the edge cases, and so you can only focus on the average users. And there's a quote, and that's what we're showing on the screen right now. There's a quote in that book from a developer called Evan Ensley, and what he said was, edge cases define the boundaries of who and what you care about. And that certainly resonates with us, because as people who are sensitive to the questions of inclusion and accessibility, we understand that edge cases are usually what we consider people with disabilities to be. And of course, caring about their inclusion, this idea of edge cases just doesn't work well for us. And surely we would agree that for people, whether it's people with disabilities, the elderly, people that are somehow marginalized by their use of technology, they're still worth our time and energy to build an experience that will also work well for them.
So that brings us to our topic. Today we're talking about personas. For those of you who aren't super familiar with what a persona is, it's basically a fake person who represents the real people who use your product. Basically, a persona is a character. Humans empathize really well with well-constructed characters. That's why fictional books and movies, radio shows, etc. are so popular. A character is generally based on the experiences and the knowledge of the people who create it. In the same way, a persona is based on the knowledge that a company has about the people who use their products. Essentially, personas answer the question, given all the different types of people in the world, which subset of those people are we designing for? And personas allow you to put yourself in the shoes of people who are not you. But a single persona can represent hundreds or thousands or even millions of users. So it gets back to the idea of the average user. Personas aren't perfect. They often represent the average user because they're an attempt to condense a lot of information about a lot of different people into a very small set of resources. They definitely don't replace doing regular user research. But a good set of personas can help a team or a company talk about and empathize with the people that they're designing for, especially at times when they can't go out and talk to users themselves. So typically how personas are created, they generally start with market and user research. That means trying to figure out who's using your product or who might be using your product, and then going out and speaking to those people. So a lot of times you'll set up a bunch of interviews with people who are your users or you think are your users, and figure out what problems they're trying to solve with your product, what backgrounds they come from, stuff like that. The act of building personas is basically formalizing who you think your users are. And there are a lot of other user research techniques that come into it too. So you might send out surveys, you might get some market research data, you might do ethnography, where you go in and observe people doing things where they're working or in their homes. You might create empathy maps or journey maps to map where a person goes throughout their life as they're using your product. So once you have all that data, basically you go through it and you figure out what the trends are. What comes up again and again? Do all of your users have similar goals or similar frustrations? Do they all come from similar backgrounds? Are there other interesting things that you've discovered, interesting trends that you don't want to forget? And once you've isolated all of those things, you summarize them into bullet points and basically add them to a character sheet. And you'll likely also have a number of interesting quotes from the people you spoke to. So you want to pick one that summarizes what you heard and attribute it to the persona that represents the people that you talk to. So in a lot of ways, persona documents are like character sheets in a role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons. Once you've created the character, you can then use the character sheet to get into that person's mindset, and you can then role-play your users when you're designing. So there are two types of personas that are common that you might be familiar with. There are buyer personas, which represent the people who have purchasing power. There are also user personas, and those represent the people who are the end users of the product. So for example, it might be the same person. Someone might be going out to buy a fitness tracker, for example, that they will then be using themselves. Or they might be different people. So a parent buying a game for their child, the parent would be the buyer, but the child would be the actual end user. So we're mainly focusing on user personas today because they tend to be focused on the user experience of the product rather than the marketing and sales concerns around the product. But the same principles of inclusive design do apply to both. So we've come up with a persona. We've named her Lucy. She's 33 years old. She's an event organizer, and she's in a long-term relationship. She doesn't have any kids, though, and she lives in Chicago. We've also invented a product to base our personas on so that we can have much more refined personas than we would otherwise. So we are pretending that we work for a company that creates fitness trackers. So the little wristbands that you have that tell you how many steps you've taken, and an accompanying app that'll help you track your goals over time. So Lucy's goals are she wants to keep up with her fitness and health goals even when she's busy. She wants to find a tracker that either looks really good or is really easy to hide. Her main exercise is walking, but she wants to do more than that to stay healthy, so she wants ideas. And her frustrations are that the free solutions aren't very accurate. And she knows she walks a lot, but she feels like it's not enough to be healthy. She also thinks a lot of the trackers she's seen aren't very fashionable. So all of her goals and frustrations in this case focus on Lucy as a buyer persona. So I've modified this persona to make it into an end user persona. So now we're pretending that Lucy has already bought the fitness tracker. So she's been using it on a regular basis. So as such, her goals and frustrations have changed. So her goals now are to figure out what her ideal steps per day should be. She wants to find more ways to be motivated to be healthy using the tracker. Her frustrations are sometimes she's too busy to remember to charge the tracker and she loses her steps, so her goals don't get met some days. And the wristband on her tracker has also come loose over time and it doesn't look as nice as it used to. So these are goals and frustrations that as a user experience designer can help you figure out better solutions for your products. So again, both types of personas are perfectly valid for different people within the company. But since this is a UX-focused webinar, we will be focusing on an end-user style of persona. So this persona will come up again and again.
So we've seen two main types of personas so far, the buyer persona and the end-user persona. But how do these types of persona actually account for those edge cases that I was mentioning before? Like those just don't fit the mold of that average user. Lucy, as we've seen it in both situations, perfectly fits that mold of the ideal persona to represent either someone who would buy the product or someone who uses it and wants to get better features or get a better experience out of it. If we account for people that have disabilities, if we account for people that are getting older, what about these guys? If we account for people that are under extreme stress or extreme stressful situations, people that use the content available for that product on mobile devices as opposed to desktop, is that going to affect how they can actually use those products? How do these perfect personas or of these ideal people using the product in an ideal condition represent those who just don't fit that mold to begin with? So when we think about personas, especially in our field of accessibility, what we tend to do is say, well, the easy solution here is really to just create a persona that reflects a disability. So we want to go beyond those ideal personas. And what happens in those situations is that we fall into the trap of designing the disability-specific personas. So they focus on the disabilities themselves, and as a result, the persona is no longer really focused on the user, but rather focused on what makes the user different. And focusing on disability often means that we end up dehumanizing the person the persona is meant to represent. So in this slide, in this version of the persona itself, we still have Lucy, same person, same job, same setting, same demographics. But now if we look at her goals, none of them are related to how she uses the tool, the tracker, or how it might be interested in buying it. It's all about her ability or inability to use said tool. Like the goals, for instance, might become she needs an app to work. She needs the app to work well with VoiceOver on her iPhone, for instance. Or she may need haptic feedback in place of purely visual feedback. She may need an option for information on tracker to be read out loud. And all of these reasons because she was born blind and she relies on screen readers and braille displays to access information. So because we're so mindful about making the app or the tracker accessible to people with disabilities, people that have a visual impairment in this case, then the persona becomes all about that, and there's nothing left for the person behind that disability. And we feel that's a problem. Similarly, looking at frustrations, she hates it when she has to rely on others to help her use the technology. She can't access the information when it's only presented visually, and she feels like trackers aren't made for people like her. So again, it's all about being blind, and there's nothing in there about being a person who wants to use that tracker. And basically, the typical type of quote that we get in those situations would be something along the lines of, I want to have the same experience as everyone else when I use the tracker. And quickly enough, when we create personas like this, what happens is we want to be thorough. So we're going to create personas for every single type of disability that we think about. And that can easily be 10, 15, 20 different types of personas. And quickly enough, this defeats the purpose of using personas in the first place, because the idea of using personas is that as a team, you can refer to Lucy as being someone who wants to do this or wants to do that. And it's pretty easy to get to know fictional characters, personas like this, when you have 3, 4, 5 maybe. But when you're up to 20 different personas, there's no way your team is going to get to know all of them and actually use all of them. So that creates a significant issue. And all three types of personas so far, what they've shown is that they can be useful for different purposes. Like, for instance, the disability persona is great to raise awareness. There's nothing wrong with that. But none of them really help create what we like to call a truly inclusive user experience.
So if you don't make personas that are specific to different disabilities, how do you make the personas you already have inclusive? So the idea that we came up with was to make small modules that can be attached to each persona, which then add extra information to that persona to flesh it out a bit based on different types of needs that come up. So the base persona remains the same. The user's main needs and their main goals will still be represented regardless of their abilities or their backgrounds. Each module can then be added on to add an extra dimension. So the main advantage of this approach is you still have a finite number of personas to keep track of, say 3 to 5, but the modules can be used as an extra checklist when you're evaluating designs. So we're going to show you a few examples of how that would work.
So let's think about Lucy again. But let's think about disability or a situation that could put her at a disadvantage in one situation or another. So maybe she has low vision. Maybe she's blind. Maybe she's deaf or hard of hearing, has a mobility impairment, has a cognitive disability, is an elderly. What if Lucy is 75 years old, for instance? Would that change something about her and how she interacts with your design, your products? It most likely would. Would you then design things differently to account for her needs and expectations if you knew that she was deaf, or that if you knew that she was 75 years old, for instance? There's really high value in interviewing users or prospective users who have disabilities as part of the process of creating the personas. There's no doubt about that. It really helps understand their needs and as it relates to the site or the application that we're building. We need to remember that the disabilities themselves actually exist on a spectrum. So none of those personas are really ever completely cut and dry. There are always variations to them. So we need to make sure that we do represent those differences in the personas. But again, having these little modules might be a way to do that where it doesn't get overwhelming, because ultimately we're still talking about Lucy. We just add some kind of filter on top of who she is to sort of look at her in a different light.
So here's an example, again, as Lucy, as someone who is born blind and who relies on screen readers and other haptic and audio feedback. So that is her particularity. So we've taken the original end user persona and added a new goal and a new frustration that reflect her particularity. So now, in addition to figuring out what her ideal steps per day goal should be and finding more ways to be healthy, Lucy's also looking for a tracker that does a really good job with audio and haptic feedback. And for her frustrations, in addition to being sometimes too busy to charge it, having wristbands that come loose. She also is frustrated that when she wants to see her tracker data, she has to use the app because there's no feedback on the tracker itself that will tell you what her goals are. So again, this is still a very product-specific persona, but it forces you to think, what are the ways you can design a fitness tracker that give appropriate feedback for Lucy if she is not able to see?
And likewise, what if Lucy comes from a different background, cultural background, for instance? Maybe she's learning a new language, English in this case. Maybe she's a new immigrant. Maybe she comes from a non-Western country. Maybe she's just poor or underprivileged living in this country. Maybe she's in an affected minority. There could be, again, a lot of different things that affect how she's going to use the product or understand how to use the product. If she has poor literacy level, for instance, or if she just struggles with written English, would that too really change something about her and how we interact, or how she interacts rather, with us and the products that we design? Would we tend to design things differently if we knew that situation that she's in, and if we wanted to account for the needs that she has, those specific needs that she has? Would knowing these things actually affect how we would design the product itself?
And so again, we've taken the same end user persona and added a couple of points to it. So now we're imagining that Lucy has just immigrated from Brazil and she still doesn't read or write English very well. Her native language is Portuguese. So her additional goal would be she wants to find a tracker that also natively supports Portuguese. One of her frustrations might be she sometimes gives up when she doesn't understand the words or the language in the application. So if you were designing a tracker for a market that doesn't speak your native language, or at least doesn't speak it very well, this could help you understand how you could change the design and think about that. So perhaps you might want to put more emphasis on internationalization or focus on using simpler words or easier language, but you wouldn't think about that if you didn't have that aspect in a persona or in the forefront of your mind.
Again, going back to Lucy, as someone who may not fit that average user mold, what if she was grieving in some kind of an emergency? What if she's overworked? If she's particularly angry that day, emotionally vulnerable, stressed out of her mind because something's coming up and she has a lot of work to do and she just can't focus as she normally would? So that stressful situation prevents her from thinking straight, for instance. Maybe there's a loved one that passed away. Maybe she's just worried she might lose her job. Again, would that too change something about her and how she interacts with the products or the applications that we build? And again, would we design things differently if we knew about that particular aspect of her as she's using our product?
So now we've taken the same persona and we've imagined that Lucy has a major event coming up and is much more stressed out than she usually is at work. So now one of her goals is to still keep up with her fitness schedule despite being very busy. But one of her frustrations is that the tracker reminders make her feel even more guilty and more stressed out because it's one more thing that she's not able to do because she is so busy right now. So how would you design for Lucy, who's incredibly stressed? And once again, the book that Denis mentioned earlier on, Design for Real Life, is a very good resource for thinking about this. They specifically tackle stress cases and how to think about design in terms of designing for people who aren't necessarily happy when they're using your application.
And all of that, the whole point of designing for the average user basically leads down a very slippery slope. So whenever we design for that user in those ideal conditions and we forget about all these stress cases, extreme cases, situations that are out of the ordinary, so to speak, we are missing some users. We are leaving some people behind. And it's very easy to lose sight of diversity in web use when we only focus on that. When we approach the design from the perspective of those extreme cases or stress cases, what we do is we actually acknowledge that those situations exist in the first place. We make sure that our designs remain enjoyable and pleasant for everyone to use. But it's really for everyone to use, not just for that ideal scenario. And by catering to the need of a few, we basically ensure a smoother, better experience for everyone else. By designing for the extremes, we ultimately let the middle, where our so-called average users live, we let it take care of itself, basically.
And one major thing to keep in mind is that personas are never complete. So if you've built personas a while back, and you come back to them 2 years later and you find that they're no longer relevant, then you haven't done your job with those personas. Personas should really always be a work in progress. Your users' needs and your priorities will change over time, and your product will change over time too. So making sure that you take the time to evaluate your personas every so often and adjust them as needed is a good way to go. And this might mean that as you're talking to more users, you're discovering more of these cases that fall outside what you might consider the average. And with this framework, that may mean that you are adding more modules to your personas as you learn about these different kinds of users and different use cases that they have.
So in a nutshell, this is what we wanted to share today. So what we've seen basically is that how personas first and foremost fit in the overall UX process, how they can inform design and choices and the process itself of design. The idea of having inclusive personas itself influences those design decisions even more. They inform a broader approach to the considerations that we would take into account. We looked into how designing for inclusion actually informs the process of designing at the same time. So again, not thinking average users, but thinking much more broadly to other types of users who may easily be left behind otherwise. How this idea of designing for the extreme actually results in better UX for all. Because again, this idea of letting the middle take care of itself by taking care of what's on the trailing ends of the bell curve. And then how to build inclusive personas using some kind of a framework that allows for modularity that will allow you to keep using personas the way they're intended to be used, which is a smaller group of people that you can refer to and associate with, but at the same time cover a gamut of different contexts of use that would not fit into a single persona if you actually built it from the get-go as being someone who's blind or someone who's deaf. But where does that lead us next, really? How can you apply the idea of the modular particularities to your personas for increased user inclusion? That's the area that Caitlin and I are exploring this year. And we want to invite you to come along for the ride, basically. We will have other webinars in this series that will keep exploring this area. Our next follow-up is at CSUN, for instance. We have one of our presentations at CSUN will cover the idea of usability heuristics, which are basically general rules of thumb about accessibility that would be pertinent to design. So that's our next step, looking into these things and how using the personas and then building according to those general rules of thumb can help designers better understand what it means to design in an inclusive manner. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for that stuff. We'll get back to you soon with more dates for webinars. And hopefully we'll see you at CSUN and we can discuss these things and more once we're all in San Diego, for those of us who get to go in San Diego. So thank you very much for that. There's also, you can follow us on DQ, follow DQ rather. You may already be familiar with our DQ Systems Twitter account. We're on GitHub under DQ Labs, on LinkedIn with DQ Systems Inc., and then also there's a YouTube channel for DQ Systems Inc., which I assume is where we're going to find this this recording eventually. And with that, I'll pass it back to Caitlin.
Okay, so thank you. Again, I'm Caitlin. I'm a UX designer at DQ. I'm based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So shout out to Chris DeMars and everyone else from the Detroit area who's listening in today.
And I'm still Denis Boudreau, consultant at DQ as well, training lead. And that's what we had for you today. Thank you.
And Denis is based in Montreal.
Oh, yes, I'm based in Montreal. And so French speaking, for those of you who didn't figure that part out yet.
So we'd like to take your questions.
Okay, so we got a couple here for you. One is, what strategies do you recommend for figuring out whether you should lump or split users into archetypes for personas?
That's a good question. A lot of building personas, in my mind, is kind of information architecture. So you're taking a whole bunch of different data from a whole bunch of different people and trying to drill it down a whole bunch. So if you have a lot of different data, like the best way to try and figure out how to create the different archetypes is to see where the trends fall. So maybe you do some kind of exercise with sticky notes where you're grouping them together in ways that make sense. So sort of like I can't remember the term for it. You take a bunch of sticky notes, you put them under headers, and then move them about and do a team exercise with it. That's one way to do it. If you're doing them alone, then I tend to just make a bunch of lists or just use sticky notes on my own and just group them together until it makes sense as much as possible. A lot of times it's not going to be clean, so usually you're just making your best guess. You're never going to make perfect personas, so don't expect that, but expect to be able to refine them later as you learn more.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, this idea of being able to go back into the drawing board and define that you actually may need another one to account for a particular situation that you have not seen thus far is part of this idea of being able to have the flexibility to do that as needed as well.
Great. Have another question here. Could you go into more detail regarding ethnography, empathy, and journey maps?
I can go into a bit of detail on that. So ethnography originally comes from anthropology. So if you're a scientist, you're going out and studying other cultures, for example, African tribes or South Americans, native South Americans. You're going and living with them for a while and observing what they do and just basically trying to understand who they are. So ethnography in the UX world generally means, contextual inquiry is another term for it. It means you go and rather than just asking someone questions and getting answers from them, you go to their workplace or their home, and you just ask them to show you what they're doing. And rather than them editing what they're telling you as they're talking to you, you can really get into the nitty-gritty of how they're doing things. Empathy maps and journey maps often come out of exercises that are ethnography related. So understanding how a person is feeling at certain parts as they're using an application, and are they feeling really good about this part? Are they happy that they registered? Are they feeling really angry because something failed and they don't know why? And mapping out how people's moods shift as they're using the product based on either the product itself or what's happening to them as they're using it. Journey maps are, when do you get a person, or when you get a person to sign up for your thing and get started with it, where do they go from there? So how many touch points do they have with your product, and what happens in between those touch points? So they might register and then go off and do something else that's related and then come back for a different purpose. So mapping that out so you get a more holistic picture of how that product fits into their lives.
And this whole approach actually allows you to build empathy towards those users, which is basically also the reason why it matters in the first place. Getting to understand how Lucy, for instance, struggles with using your tracker because she's been dissatisfied with previous experiences using similar trackers, for instance. Being able to understand where that comes from helps you understand where she would like to go next, what she would like to experience next. And then you can start developing and designing and building towards meeting that goal, as opposed to designing for what you could consider to be the current situation right now. It allows you to sort of to propel yourself in the future, so to speak, so the users will find value and pleasure in something that you are building now, but that will also remain relevant in the future. The whole idea of the empathy mapping exercise, for instance, is fleshing out those goals and frustrations based on something that is actually based in data, as opposed to just say, oh, we came up with these 2 or 3 different things that sound cool. That doesn't usually help much, but when everything is based in research and interview and data, like Caitlin was saying earlier, then it makes the persona that much more relevant, that much more credible, and as a result of that, much more likely to represent the reality of people out there, either considering purchasing or already using the product.
Great, thanks, Denis. We have another question here. Just to clarify, is your main premise for this webinar implying that designing as, in this example, for the 2 extremes will accommodate for the average user?
Pretty much. That's how we like to think about it. So whether it's in training or at conferences or through discussions online or in person, really, with designers specifically, we often get asked that question of why isn't it sufficient to think about the average user, and then we get into the whole discussion about difference in web use and everything about accessibility and how people can easily be left aside. So the idea of the webinar is really to underline the importance of stopping to think about the average user as a viable solution to build something that is meant to reach a broad audience. Yes, it's going to reach a broad audience, but when we start trying to define what broad means, it's actually much more narrow than we think. I'm not going to get into all the statistics about disabilities, but we more or less agree that without even trying really hard, we can easily find about 1/3 of the population that either falls under the category of people being older than 65 or having a disability. So by broad, if broad means reaching to 2/3 of the population with my product, I would say that I'm putting my bar pretty low, and I can do better than that. So not thinking about the average user, but thinking about the other users first and foremost, account for their needs, And then by doing that, creating a product that's easier to use for people with disabilities, that's easier to use for people that are older or people that are from a different cultural background, for instance, will automatically make things smoother, less complicated, more obvious, more predictable, more intuitive for those who don't need those accommodations in the first place, but will still benefit from something who went through the process of being streamlined that way. So yeah, so that's basically the idea behind this that we're pushing. But at the same time, being very mindful that if you go towards building disability personas, so that basically exist only for the representation of the disability and dehumanize the person that they're supposed to represent, then we're sort of missing the point, because it's no longer about the person, it's about a disability. And one of the things that we know we shouldn't do is design for blindness or design for deafness or design for dyslexia. You want to think about those things and think about the issues that people that have those issues may run into, but you want to do that in a much more realistic way where it's part of a bigger, like a bigger goal. It's not just a small checklist of things you check and then you're guaranteed that the blind dude over there will be able to use the site as well, or the application. It's much more, needs to be much more realistic than just that.
Yeah, to give a quick concrete example, for example, Lucy, who spoke Portuguese as a native language and didn't know much English, if you design a bit more for her and make sure that, for example, everything that isn't English uses shorter words, shorter sentences, and just less text in general and make it clearer, that's going to benefit everyone, not just Lucy, who doesn't speak English very well. I'm going to have an easier time with that, and I have a pretty decent vocabulary.
Mm-hmm. And in the same train of thought, let's say the same line of thought, someone like me who has English as a second language, there's only so much vocabulary that I really master in English. If we're purposefully using simpler language, I benefit from that, even though I don't have dyslexia to begin with. So that same idea works in all contexts. It would work for someone who maybe is deaf, was born deaf, and has English as a second language. Again, the references are not going to be the same. So if we don't make assumptions about how much language people actually control or master, and we pay attention to these things, it makes it easier for even someone who has a university degree. They don't have to think as much when they're reading because everything is so obvious that it just makes sense. It's much smoother, much easier to use as a result of that.
Great. So I have a really good question here, asking how much time, if possible, as a percentage, should you spend building your personas?
I think that really depends on what kind of workplace you're working in. So here at DQ, we use agile methodologies, which means that everything just goes very fast. It also depends on how many different kinds of people you think that your products are serving. So if you have to go out and interview a lot of different kinds of people, it will take longer to create your personas. So typically, like, you want to interview, say, 3 to 5 people in each user group that you think exists. So if you're creating 3 personas, you do half-hour interviews for each user, then I can't do the math in my head, but you could probably figure that out. And then you want to spend about the same amount of time that you spend interviewing, consolidating all that information and finding trends, and ideally working with your coworkers to figure out who the personas are.
And along the same lines, the personas that I use in training are, for the most part, informed through usability testing that we've done in the past with different clients. So everything is anonymized, of course, but the general persona itself comes from a very specific situation that we've encountered. And then what I do is I turn that information into a persona in this case. So it's not so much based in research, like broad research in this case. I'm thinking about very specific individuals and issues that they had, and I'm using the issues that they had to raise awareness and understanding about how other people may use the web. So in my case, building the personas was a much smoother or faster process because I don't need to represent users that are going to be using a product per se. It's really for raising awareness purposes more first and foremost. And sometimes it's going to be enough also, depending on what you're building. It doesn't have to be a complicated process, but I think Caitlin would agree with me when I say that the more these personas are based in research and findings from research, the more relevant they become. And the more time you spend doing that, then the more time it takes to actually build them in the first place.
Great. I have another question here. Did you use national data to identify what disabilities are most common to start with your inclusive personas?
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure that I understood the question.
So when building inclusive personas, do you use national data to identify what disabilities are the most common?
Yes, I guess. So I'm Canadian. I tend to use US-driven data because that's where most of our clients are. So in a way, yes, it's very much driven by that. But it depends on context, I guess. If I'm presenting something, say at CSUN, where I know that people will come from all over the world, I try to go at a level that would be more international in terms of where I get my data or the data points that I'm using. But yeah, DQ being mostly based in the States, of course, most of our data is driven from that perspective.
Okay, I have another one here. For non-UX people, do you often encounter difficulty in talking to development teams or stakeholders to take a certain approach in product or application design? What happens when dev teams don't agree with the UX team's findings?
Yeah. Speaking as a UX person, what happens is that one side gets their way and the other side doesn't. The ways to mitigate that, at least from my perspective, are to make sure that the development team is involved in the user research. So ask them to sit in on interviews or to help you go through the data that comes out of interviews or usability tests or whatever. And that way they can see for themselves what's happening rather than taking your word for it. Of course, you're still going to have different interpretations. So you always want to make sure to hash out at least some of the data with them so that you can talk through your interpretations and agree one way or the other.
Yeah, and then maybe to add to that, I'm thinking whenever I run into a situation like that where different functional areas just won't collaborate or agree on things, it's usually a symptom of something that's much more complicated than just them disagreeing on that particular issue. And oftentimes the solution is not so much in finding common ground, though that's possible. If everybody's willing to give in a little bit, maybe there's a way to find consensus. But oftentimes what is needed is really to go back to their leadership and say someone has to make a decision here, because in the better interest of the organization, your different functional need to align to a particular goal. And oftentimes what happens is it isn't so much that developers would push back on what designer wants, but it's the idea that, or vice versa really, but it's the idea that one group may know something that the other group doesn't know, and the other group is unaware that what they're asking for just doesn't work. And in that case, again, it goes back to this idea of making sure that everybody's on the same page as to what is expected and how you can achieve the expected results. So maybe that's training, maybe that's coaching, maybe that's them just collaborating more to explain what those differences are or where the discrepancies are, instead of just pushing back and not wanting to collaborate.
Yeah, if you have the information, share it.
Okay, great. It looks like we have one more question, which kind of will wrap up the webinar nicely. So just to summarize, can you explain why webinars help as opposed to just simply considering a list of potential user traits? Is it just a clumping mechanism?
You mean why personas help?
Yes, just to wrap up the importance of them.
Hmm. Well, I'll try something, and you can cover for me also, Caitlin. But I think the main reason why the personas matter so much is that otherwise you're working towards a goal by thinking about something or someone that doesn't really exist for you. I mean, the personas don't exist. I mean, we understand that part, but because we can think about a face, we can put a face, we can put a name to a goal or a struggle, it humanizes it again. And to me, the humanizing part is super important here because it's easy to say, for instance, well, we're going to build this application or this website so it's accessible. We have to meet WCAG 2 level AA, blah, blah, blah. So here's a checklist. We can check all of those things and we're fine. So a lot of people do just that. They create something that actually maybe sometimes even complies with the standard, but it's limited in how inclusive it is because there's only so much that you're going to be mindful of, and there's only so much that you're going to think about as you're designing, and you will leave some people behind. And we don't think it's the best approach to do this. Beyond this idea of just compliance and checking off things off of a checklist, using personas is one way to always keep in mind that your job as a designer, your job as a developer, your job as a QA person, your job as a content creator, and whatever other role there are out there, your job is to make sure that what you're doing helps, empowers, and allows people to use that content just like everybody else. To me, anything below that is just not acceptable. So if you have personas, you can put a face to that situation, to that name. There's someone there that you're working towards. You have a person that you want to help with what you're working on, with what you're doing. If you don't have those personas, it's very easy to forget that. It's very easy to think of your job as a very technical thing. You're checking off things off of a checklist and you're done. And you never think about it twice. So to me, that's the main value of having personas, or actually, or at the very least, thinking about inclusive design as an approach to accessibility that goes way beyond just wanting to meet requirements.
Yeah, I would just add that personas are a really great tool for getting everyone on the same page about who the people you're building these applications or products or whatever you're building, who's actually going to be using it. They're a really great tool for bringing new employees up to speed on who you're designing these things for.
Great. Thanks, guys. Thanks for those great responses. So with that, we have about 5 minutes left, but it looks like we've gone through all of our questions. So I think we'll just wrap up with that. Just a friendly reminder, this is the first part of our UX and accessibility webinar series. We're excited to bring you more for the future, so keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook and our events page. We'll be announcing more in the future soon. And then special thanks to Caitlin and Denis for their great job presenting. We will send out an email in the next few days with the presentation materials and the recording. So thanks again for joining, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all.